The storm that hit Madrid that October evening came without warning, transforming the city's streets from busy thoroughfares into rivers of rain and wind that sent pedestrians scrambling for shelter wherever they could find it. The weather had been mild and pleasant just hours earlier, but by 7 o'clock, the sky had darkened to an ominous charcoal gray and unleashed a deluge that overwhelmed the city's drainage systems and turned simple errands into exercises in survival. Cristiano Ronaldo had been caught in the storm while returning from a private meeting with his financial advisors, a routine appointment that should have concluded with a quick drive home to his comfortable penthouse. Instead, his driver had been forced to pull over when visibility became too poor to continue safely, leaving Ronaldo stranded in an unfamiliar neighborhood where modest apartment buildings and small businesses lined narrow streets that were now becoming increasingly flooded. The area was far from the upscale districts where Ronaldo usually spent his time, a working-class community where people lived paycheck to paycheck, and where the storm represented not just inconvenience, but genuine hardship for those whose livelihoods depended on weather-sensitive work. As Ronaldo waited in the car, watching the rain pound against the windows and the wind bend street signs at impossible angles, he noticed a small figure struggling to secure what appeared to be a food cart against the storm's fury. The person was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, who was desperately trying to cover his cart with a plastic tarp while the wind whipped the material away from his hands again and again. Each time he managed to get one corner secured, another would come loose, and his efforts to protect his livelihood from the storm were clearly failing despite his determination and persistence. Ronaldo watched this struggle for several minutes, growing increasingly uncomfortable with his position as a passive observer of someone else's distress. Finally, unable to simply sit and watch any longer, he made a decision that his driver and security team would have advised against under normal circumstances. Despite the storm raging outside, despite being in an unfamiliar neighborhood, and despite the risks that came with venturing out unprotected, Ronaldo opened the car door and stepped into the tempest to help a stranger whose name he didn't know and whose story he had never heard. The wind and rain hit him immediately with a force that was shocking, even though he had watched the storm from inside the car. Within seconds, his expensive clothing was soaked through, and he had to lean into the wind to avoid being knocked off balance as he made his way toward the elderly vendor who was still fighting to protect his cart. The man was so focused on his battle with the tarp that he didn't notice Ronaldo's approach until he suddenly found himself with unexpected assistance in holding down the corners of the covering. "Let me help you," Ronaldo shouted over the sound of the wind and rain, grabbing one corner of the tarp while the elderly vendor secured another. Together, they managed to get the plastic covering properly attached and anchored, protecting the cart's contents from the worst of the storm's assault. Only then did the elderly man look up to see who had come to his aid, and his expression showed complete shock when he realized that one of the world's most famous athletes had just helped him save his livelihood from destruction. "Dios mío," the man whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You're Cristiano Ronaldo. What are you doing out here in this storm?" Ronaldo smiled despite being completely drenched and buffeted by the continuing wind. "I saw you struggling with the tarp and thought you could use some help. Are you all right? Is there somewhere we can get out of this weather?" The elderly vendor, whose name was Eduardo Morales, looked around at the storm that was still raging around them, and then at his small food cart, which represented his entire livelihood and life savings. His expression showed the internal conflict of someone who wanted to offer hospitality, but was acutely aware of the limitations of his circumstances. After a moment's hesitation, he gestured toward a small alcove next to his cart, where a narrow overhang provided minimal but crucial protection from the rain. "We can shelter here," Eduardo said, his voice still filled with amazement at finding himself in conversation with one of his country's greatest sports heroes. "It's not much, but it's better than standing in the open." They huddled together in the small space, two men from vastly different worlds brought together by circumstance and a shared need to escape the storm's fury. Eduardo's cart, now safely covered, contained the simple equipment and ingredients he used to make bocadillos and other street food for the neighborhood's workers and residents. It was clear from the cart's worn condition and the careful way Eduardo organized his limited supplies that this small business represented not a choice between many options, but a necessity for survival in a life that offered few alternatives. As they waited for the storm to subside, Eduardo studied Ronaldo with the wonder of someone encountering a figure who had previously existed only in the realm of television and newspapers. "I've watched you play for years," he said, shaking his head in continued disbelief. "My grandson is your biggest fan. He has posters of you all over his room and practices football every day, dreaming of being like you someday. He's not going to believe that I met you, especially like this." Ronaldo was curious about Eduardo's story and began asking questions about his life, his work, and his family. What emerged was a picture of a man who had been selling food from his cart in this neighborhood for over 15 years, working 7 days a week to support himself and help his daughter raise her children after her husband had been killed in a construction accident. Eduardo's pride in his work was evident despite its humble nature, and his love for his family shone through every story he told about his grandson's football aspirations and his daughter's efforts to provide for her children while working as a house cleaner. "Business has been difficult lately," Eduardo admitted as the storm continued to rage around their small shelter. "People have less money to spend on food from carts, and the weather has been unpredictable. Some days I make enough to cover my expenses, other days I barely break even. But I keep working because my family depends on me, and this cart represents everything I've been able to build in my life." As they talked, Ronaldo began to understand that Eduardo's situation was representative of thousands of people in Madrid and millions around the world who lived on the economic margins, working hard every day but always vulnerable to circumstances beyond their control. A storm like tonight's could represent not just inconvenience but genuine financial hardship for someone whose daily income depended on being able to work regardless of weather conditions. The conversation was interrupted when Eduardo suddenly looked at his watch and realized how late it had become. "You must be hungry," he said, his natural hospitality overcoming his awareness of their different circumstances. "I can't let you leave without offering you something to eat. It's not fancy food, but it's made with good ingredients and a lot of care." Despite Ronaldo's protests that it wasn't necessary, Eduardo insisted on preparing food for both of them, working efficiently in the cramped space beside his cart to assemble bocadillos with ham, cheese, and vegetables. The meal was simple but delicious, made special not by exotic ingredients or sophisticated preparation, but by the obvious care and pride that Eduardo put into his work. As they ate together in their improvised shelter, sharing food and conversation while the storm slowly began to subside around them, Ronaldo found himself experiencing something he rarely encountered in his carefully managed life: genuine human connection without any agenda or expectation beyond the simple sharing of a meal and conversation between two people who had found themselves in the same place at the same time. When Eduardo insisted that Ronaldo should not pay for the food, explaining that it was his honor to feed someone who had helped him and who brought so much joy to his grandson, Ronaldo accepted the gift with gratitude while privately making plans that Eduardo could not yet imagine. The storm finally began to weaken, and Ronaldo's driver, who had been worried about his employer's disappearance, located them in their small shelter. As Ronaldo prepared to leave, he shook Eduardo's hand warmly and thanked him for the food and conversation. "Your grandson sounds like a wonderful boy," Ronaldo said. "I hope he continues to work hard at football and at school. Please tell him that Cristiano Ronaldo believes in him and wants him to follow his dreams." Eduardo's eyes filled with tears as he realized what this encounter would mean to his grandson. "He will never believe this," Eduardo said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have given my family a story we will treasure forever." But Ronaldo's involvement in Eduardo's life was just beginning, though the elderly vendor had no way of knowing that, as he watched the expensive car disappear into the night. The following morning, Ronaldo made several phone calls to people who specialized in helping him navigate situations that required both discretion and significant resources. He had been moved by Eduardo's dignity, work ethic, and devotion to his family, and he wanted to do something meaningful to acknowledge those qualities and provide support that would make a real difference in the vendor's life. The first step was research. Ronaldo's team discreetly gathered information about Eduardo's situation, confirming his story about his daughter's circumstances, his grandson's passion for football, and his own long history of honest work in the neighborhood. What they discovered was a man whose reputation for kindness and reliability had made him beloved in his community despite his modest circumstances. Eduardo was known for extending credit to customers who were short on money, for hiring homeless individuals to help with his cart when he could afford to pay them, and for donating food to families in crisis, even when doing so strained his own resources. Armed with this information, Ronaldo began to develop a plan that would address not just Eduardo's immediate needs, but his long-term security and his family's future opportunities. The plan was complex and required coordination with various organizations and institutions, but Ronaldo was determined to create something that would be both comprehensive and sustainable, something that would honor Eduardo's dignity while providing meaningful assistance. The first surprise came 3 days after the storm, when Eduardo arrived at his usual spot to set up his cart and found a building inspector waiting for him with official documents. Eduardo's heart sank, assuming that some bureaucratic problem was about to threaten his livelihood, but the inspector's message was entirely different from what he had feared. The city, the inspector explained, had received an anonymous donation specifically designated for infrastructure improvements in Eduardo's neighborhood, including the installation of a permanent covered pavilion with electrical connections and water access where food vendors could operate regardless of weather conditions. The donor specified that the improvements should benefit hardworking vendors who serve their communities with dignity and pride, the inspector explained. Your neighbors recommended you as someone who embodies those qualities, so you'll have the first opportunity to rent space in the new facility once construction is completed. Eduardo was speechless, unable to comprehend how such an opportunity had suddenly materialized. The covered pavilion would solve his biggest challenge, the vulnerability to weather that made his work uncertain and sometimes dangerous. With reliable shelter and access to utilities, he could expand his offerings, serve customers more consistently, and build a more stable income that would provide security for his family. The second surprise came the following week, when Eduardo received a visit from a representative of a local culinary school who explained that an anonymous benefactor had established a scholarship fund specifically for family members of small business owners in the food service industry. The scholarship would cover full tuition, books, and living expenses for students who wanted to pursue careers in restaurant management, culinary arts, or food service entrepreneurship. Your daughter has been recommended for this opportunity, the representative explained, showing Eduardo documents that would allow his daughter to leave her house cleaning job and pursue formal training that could lead to much better employment opportunities. The program includes job placement assistance and business development support for graduates who want to start their own food service businesses. Eduardo stared at the paperwork, realizing that this opportunity could transform his daughter's life and provide her with the economic stability and career prospects that her current situation would never offer. The scholarship would not only improve her immediate circumstances, but give her the skills and credentials necessary to build a secure future for herself and her children. The third surprise was the most personal and meaningful of all. 2 weeks after the storm, Eduardo was working at his cart when a luxury car pulled up and Ronaldo stepped out, accompanied by a boy who Eduardo immediately recognized from family photographs as Ronaldo's own son. But they weren't alone. With them was Eduardo's 12-year-old grandson, Miguel, who had apparently been brought to this meeting through arrangements that Eduardo couldn't begin to understand. "Grandfather!" Miguel called out, running toward Eduardo with excitement that was visible from across the street. "Look who came to see us! Cristiano brought me here to surprise you, and he wants to meet our whole family." What followed was an afternoon that Eduardo would remember for the rest of his life. Ronaldo spent over 2 hours with Eduardo's family, talking with Miguel about his football training and school performance, meeting Eduardo's daughter and learning about her dreams for the future, and sharing a meal prepared by Eduardo at his cart. The lunch was photographed not by media professionals, but by family members capturing a moment they wanted to preserve forever. During their conversation, Ronaldo explained his philosophy about success and responsibility. "When I was young," he told Miguel, "people helped me when they didn't have to. Coaches spent extra time with me, teachers believed in me when my grades weren't perfect, neighbors encouraged me when others said my dreams were impossible. Everything I've achieved is built on the foundation of people who chose to invest in my potential when I had nothing to offer them in return." He looked at Eduardo with obvious respect and affection. "Your grandfather is one of those people now. He helped me during the storm, not because he knew who I was or because he wanted something from me, but because he saw someone who needed assistance and chose to provide it. That's the kind of character that creates strong families and strong communities, and it's something that should be recognized and supported." The afternoon concluded with Ronaldo presenting Miguel with a complete set of football equipment, including shoes, uniforms, and training gear, along with an invitation to attend a Real Madrid practice session where he could train with some of the club's youth players. But he also gave Miguel something even more valuable: a letter of recommendation that would help him gain admission to one of Madrid's best football academies if he continued to work hard at both athletics and academics. For Eduardo's daughter, Ronaldo provided information about the scholarship opportunity and assured her that additional support would be available for childcare and transportation while she attended school. He also gave her contact information for a restaurant owner who was looking for someone with her work ethic and determination to help manage a new location that was opening in their neighborhood. But perhaps most importantly, Ronaldo gave Eduardo something that money couldn't buy: recognition for the values and character that had guided his life. "You taught me something important during that storm," Ronaldo told Eduardo as they prepared to part ways. "You showed me that generosity and kindness aren't about having abundant resources to share. They're about choosing to help others even when you're struggling yourself. That's a lesson worth more than any trophy I've ever won." As the months passed, Eduardo's life was transformed in ways that went far beyond the material improvements to his circumstances. The covered pavilion where he now worked provided security and stability that allowed him to expand his business and serve more customers. His daughter thrived in culinary school and eventually opened her own small restaurant with business development support from the scholarship program. Miguel's football skills improved dramatically with proper training and equipment, but more importantly, his academic performance excelled, as he understood that education was just as crucial as athletic ability for achieving his dreams. But the most significant change was in Eduardo's understanding of his own worth and the value of the example he had set for his family. The recognition and support he had received helped him see that his years of honest work, community service, and family devotion represented achievements that were worthy of respect and celebration. He had always viewed himself as someone who was simply doing what needed to be done to survive and provide for his loved ones. But Ronaldo's intervention helped him understand that his character and choices had created positive effects that extended far beyond his immediate circumstances. A year after the storm, Eduardo received one final surprise: an invitation to attend a Real Madrid match as Ronaldo's personal guest, along with his entire family. They were given VIP seats, a tour of the stadium, and the opportunity to meet the team before the match began. But the most memorable moment came when Ronaldo, during his pre-game warm-up, pointed toward Eduardo in the stands and waved, acknowledging the man who had taught him that true generosity comes not from abundance, but from the willingness to share whatever you have with someone who needs it more. The story of Eduardo and Ronaldo's encounter during the storm became a private legend within their families and neighborhood. But it was never shared with the media or turned into a publicity opportunity. Instead, it remained what it had always been, a genuine human connection between two people who had discovered that kindness creates bonds that transcend economic circumstances, social status, and the artificial barriers that too often separate people who have more in common than they realize. Years later, when Miguel achieved his dream of playing professional football and dedicated his first professional goal to his grandfather, Eduardo would tell the story of the storm to reporters who wanted to understand the inspiration behind the family's success. But he would always conclude the story the same way. Cristiano Ronaldo is a great footballer, but that's not why I respect him. I respect him because when he saw someone who needed help, he didn't hesitate to provide it, even though it cost him nothing to stay in his car and drive away. That's the kind of person I want my grandson to become, and that's the lesson that matters more than any trophy or achievement. Eduardo's food cart eventually evolved into a small restaurant that became a neighborhood institution, known for its excellent food and for Eduardo's practice of hiring people who needed second chances and supporting young people who were working to achieve their dreams. Above the restaurant's counter, Eduardo hung a simple sign that read, "Kindness is the only investment that never fails," a reminder of the lesson he had learned during a storm when two strangers discovered that helping each other was the most natural thing in the world.